We're continuing to cover breaking news out of the UK, where Prime Minister Boris Johnson has been moved to the intensive care unit due to coronavirus. NBC News chief foreign correspondent Bill Neely has the very latest. Bill, what more can you tell us?
Yeah, hi, Alison. So that news broke just under 2 hours ago that he was moved to the intensive care unit of St. Thomas's Hospital, which is actually just across the river from Westminster and from Downing Street. We understand now that he is conscious, and Downing Street is briefing that he's been moved to the intensive care unit so he can go on a ventilator if his condition worsens further. But it clearly began to worsen during the afternoon. Remember, Boris Johnson first said that he had coronavirus 11 days ago, but he said the symptoms were mild and that he just had a temperature. Well, today, Downing Street stopped saying that his condition was mild. They said he had a cough and a fever, and now it appears to be much, much worse than that. He has no underlying health conditions, but he is and has been for many years overweight. He has tried to run and to cycle to try and lose some weight. The problem is that it's well known that people who are overweight and who have coronavirus may struggle in hospital. So Boris Johnson moved to an intensive care unit. He will, of course, now spend a second night in hospital. And having been moved there, it is most unlikely that he will leave that intensive care unit in the next day or so. Alison?
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.